Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Dr. David Bernstein. I'm in the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience at Maastricht University, and I'm really glad to welcome you to this webinar about staying psychologically fit in Corona times. Now, you probably have noticed a lot of advice. You know that you can go on the internet and get all kinds of advice about coping with Corona and how you should handle yourself during quarantine. Things like doing sport and structuring your time, working on some self-actualization, finding meaning and purpose in this, new world we're living in, starting a hobby maybe, or spending quality time with people you love. Well, sometimes it can just feel like too much. I mean, really, come on. Here we are living and dealing with difficult things, and we're supposed to now go and do all this stuff. Now, my best advice to you for dealing with the times that we're in is the following. Take it easy. Just do the best that you can under these circumstances. Be kind to yourself. These are tough times. And really the last thing that you need is more expectations. So take a deep breath and, just try to do the best you can on a day-to-day basis. Here we are with the famous hierarchy of needs from Abraham Maslow. Now, maybe some of you are familiar with this. If you've taken psychology courses, this is in every single introductory psychology textbook. And what Maslow's pyramid tells us is that we first need to focus on or satisfy the needs in the bottom of the pyramid before we can focus on the needs in the top of the pyramid. So we first need to satisfy our biological needs, like for food and so forth. We need to, and our needs for safety, and then our needs for love and belonging. And only after that can we focus on the needs for esteem and self-actualization. Now, what's very interesting is that not consciously, but unconsciously, our bodies know this. And you may find that certain things that under normal circumstances you're able to do pretty easily feel more difficult in these times, that you may find yourself having more difficulty focusing, that you may experience more unwanted stress. And part of the reason for that is because our bodies and our brains now, whether we realize it or not, want us to focus on our basic needs, our biological needs, our needs for safety, and our needs for connection. And yet, this represents a mismatch between how we are now and how our bodies are now and how they're responding and the world that we normally live in non-corona times. And let me show you what I mean here. Okay, so we talked about Maslow's priority of needs. This is Bernstein's hierarchy of priorities. And let's say that you had to, or somebody asked you a question, how do you prioritize between these three things? Work, family, and health. Well, a student once asked me this, and I very confidently said, well, I put my health first because that's the basis of everything else. And then my family, because they're really important to me. And then finally, work is in the third place. But I must admit that after she asked me this question, after I went home and I thought about it a little bit, I thought, no, I wasn't being honest with myself. That much of the time I put my work in the first position. And that's a big source of stress in our normal daily lives, that we try to balance somehow our work with family and health, but oftentimes the demands of our performance-oriented society and our own internal demands put work in the first place. And so in Corona times, our bodies and our brains are forcing us to reprioritize. Our bodies and our brains are forcing us to put our health in the first position. And then family, because that's our sense of belonging and connection, and putting work in the third place. That's a major adjustment that we are making on an individual basis and that our society is having to grapple with in these very different times that we're living in. What happens when you ignore Bernstein's hierarchy? I want to show you a video clip and you're going to see a good example. And hopefully, oh, wait a minute, it didn't work. Tell you what this is. This is the Dutch Parliament. And this is one of our politicians, Geert Wilders, who was essentially questioning the Dutch Minister of Health a few weeks ago. And in the middle of Geert Wilders' question, look what happened.
De apparaten, de beademingsapparatuur, dat die minister alles moet doen om te zorgen dat er voldoende is. Mijn vraag aan hem is, weet hij hoeveel is voldoende? Dat is mijn eerste vraag. Mijn tweede vraag is...
Wacht even, ik schors de vergadering.
What happened here is that the Minister of Health fainted. He fainted in the middle of the Dutch Parliament a few weeks ago. Now, afterward, he was questioned about what happened. His name is Bruno Bruins. And he said that he was exhausted from weeks of intense work working on this health crisis. And you can really feel for him. But here's a good example of how if you don't pay attention to your body, at a certain point, you're going to experience overload and a kind of shutdown. So don't ignore Bernstein's hierarchy. You know, no matter what the pile of work that you have or what your internal standards are, if you need to pay attention to your body right now and to those basic biological needs and listen to what your body is telling you. Now, okay, so here we are in these very, very different times that we're living in. And yet, you know, what's interesting about that is that these times, even though they are unprecedented in our lifetime, are actually have some similarities to other times that humankind has gone through. And in all of those periods, humanity somehow has been able to get through, you know, all of these previous challenges, waves of adversity, you know, pandemics, other kinds of things. So for example, you know, the Spanish flu in 1918, you may have heard, you know, maybe killed up to 50 million people. The Great Plague of London in 1665, it's very interesting. If you look at, you know, Shakespeare's plays at the Globe Theatre, in that year, 70% of those performances had to be canceled because of the Great Plague. So, you know, we're not the only ones experiencing this kind of thing. You know, the Black Plague of 1347. You can even go further back to the 10 plagues of Egypt. Now, you know, those are in the Bible, and you might think, well, that didn't really happen. We don't know if it really happened or not. But there are some scientists who point to the fact that in 1620 BCE, there was an enormous volcanic eruption in the island of Santorini, which is in present-day Greece, and that this may have caused some of the plagues that are described in the Bible. So we can look back at all of these periods and see how people coped. But you know what? We can even go back further. We can even go back to the Ice Age. As you probably know, there have been several ice ages, and the most recent one ended in around 13,000 BCE. And at that time, as you know, because of, you know, the extremely cold temperatures that humanity was dealing with, it led to some pretty big changes in people's lifestyles. Now, here are some artists' depiction of what life might have looked like during the last ice age. And as you see, it doesn't actually look that bad. I mean, if you look at the cave there on the left, you know, they have lots of room, they're cooking, somebody seems to be going out to go and maybe hunt, they got a little childcare going on there, and all of this incredible cave art is being produced, you know, which we can now see today in some of these caves in southern France and other places. Now, what's very interesting to think about is that even though those conditions look so different than the kinds of conditions that, you know, we are facing today, that humanity in that period, that human beings then were the same as they are now. That the people, Homo sapiens living 15,000 years ago were identical to the way we are now. They were identical physically, they were identical psychologically, they were identical emotionally. Now that's fascinating to think about. So how did they cope? Well, the picture on the right with the cave painting gives one potential answer. Now, I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to ever see any of these cave paintings live, and I certainly hope that when you have the opportunity after these Corona times are over, that you visit some of them. Because what's remarkable when you see these things live is that these paintings could have been created by modern people. They are detailed and beautiful, and they clearly have something to do with the spiritual beliefs of the people involved. And so perhaps one of the ways that people were coping, even back in those days, was by finding some kind of meaning in their experience. Okay. Now, following on the metaphor of, what can we learn from, our ancestors from the Ice Age? We can ask the question, here you're going through quarantine, and amazingly enough, at this time, about half of the world's population is in some form of quarantine. I'm talking about 4 billion people. You can ask yourself, what do you need in your cave? What do you need in your cave right now? Wherever your cave is, whatever your cave is, what do you need in your cave in order to be able to survive and to thrive the best you can? And here's a cartoon, and you see these two hermits, and they're talking with each other, and one of them has a laptop, and they're off there obviously in the middle of the desert or something, and one of them has come out of his cave, and he's sitting there on a rock, and he says to the other one, "That's what I love about social media. I can have connections with thousands of people and yet still be completely isolated and alone." And isn't that a fitting statement for our situation now? On the one hand, we're quite isolated, and at the same time, we have this world of infinite connections through social media. Now, here is a modern cave dweller, Scott Kelly. Scott Kelly is an astronaut, and he spent a year on the International Space Station. And he wrote really a terrific piece in the New York Times on March the 21st, where he was able to try to give some tips, some advice based on his experiences of being there, isolated with a small crew in the International Space Station for a whole year. And how was he able to get along, and how was he able to manage, and what helped him? If you haven't already, I really recommend you read this article. One of the things he said is follow a schedule. And what he said was that, in quarantine or in his situation, every day seems to blend into another one. And it's also very easy to get out of our natural rhythms. And what's the reason for that? Many of us depend on external structure in order to manage our daily rhythms. The structure of getting up in the morning and going to work or going to school, or coming back in the evening, or whatever it is that we do. So he said, put together a schedule for yourself and follow it. But he also said, pace yourself. And that's one of the interesting things, because apparently he experienced some of the stresses there in that environment. Even though he's an astronaut and obviously a super resilient guy, he experienced some of the stresses that we're experiencing. So he said, pay attention to your body, take time to do fun things. It's not the same as living in normal circumstances. He also said, go outside. And, what does that mean in his case? Well, taking a spacewalk. But it also said, he talked about bringing the outside inside. So for example, he created a small garden, and he said that garden just helped to soothe and calm him. And there is research showing actually that nature and exposure to nature will soothe and calm us. So that's a very nice, easy thing that you can do to reduce your stress response. He also mentioned having a hobby, and you might think, okay, an astronaut, he's going to have some really cool and really sophisticated hobbies. Well, it turns out his hobby was watching, binge watching Game of Thrones. That was his hobby. But okay, so it suggests that you don't have to do something really, really fancy in order to, perhaps manage a little bit better, in situation of quarantine.